She has just been the recipient of so many honored and distinguished awards. She also has written the book, The City After Abandonment, Mapping Detroit, Evolving Land Use Patterns and Connections, in 2015. Her book, Planning Progress, Lessons from Shoghi Effendi, in 1999, received an award from the Association for Baha'i Studies, where she explored the planning and leadership styles exemplified by the head of the Baha'i faith during a series of global plans. Recent research for an anticipated book-length manuscript considers racial oppression and Black community resilience during the civil rights era in South Carolina. And that, I'm sure everyone is going to want to get into. She currently serves on the local spiritual assembly of the Bahá'ís of Ann Arbor in Michigan and has served in several other volunteer capacities for the Baha'i faith. I've had the joy of running into her for so many years in different Baha'i gatherings. She's a native of South Carolina. She has lived in Michigan for most of her adult life, and her husband, Richard Thomas. They have 2 adult children. She formerly taught at Michigan State University, where she created programs that assisted neighborhoods and community organizations in several distressed Michigan cities. Next, we have David Grammer. He received his master's degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis in marriage and family therapy in 2011 from Pepperdine University and has been a licensed therapist since then. He has worked in the community with mental health with adults battling homelessness and prolonged substance abuse. They've worked with adolescents in residential treatment focusing on substance abuse and major mental health disorders from 2014 to 2019. And that year, 2019, he founded Grammer Family Therapy. He believes that therapy is a process that should be goal-oriented and focused on solving the problems the individual is facing, and that it can be an off and on process that one has to go through. Dave has dedicated his life to the service of others. He lived in Africa for a year, did volunteer work, and he organized, I remember this, free open mic nights, gave voice to many youth, as I remember, and has done a lot of humanitarian work. He also is really into the Afro-Brazilian martial art community in Los Angeles. He has been training for 10 years and teaching for the last 7 years. Dave has taught students from 2 years old up to 80 years old. And last but not least, if there were groupies, I was definitely a Richard Thomas groupie because I would follow him at conferences and try to get some knowledge in my head about race relations. So Professor Thomas was teaching at Michigan State University, where he taught courses on Black urban experience, comparative Black history, and U.S. race relations. He has lectured on race relations and the Black experience in England, Switzerland, Ireland, Australia, Israel, and South Africa. His books include Life for Us is What We Make It, Building Black Community in Detroit, 1915 to 1945. The next book, Understanding Interracial Unity, a study of U.S. relations with Sage Publications. And he co-edited with Gwen Eder-Lewis the book Lights of the Spirit, Historical Portraits of Black Baha'is in North America, 1898 to 2000. And we're proud that Gwen is also on the faculty with us and will be teaching the anti-Black racism course coming up with the Wilmette Institute. we're so privileged to have such amazing people. As you can imagine, Richard is also the recipient of many awards, the Meyer Center Award for the Study of Human Rights in North America, and for his book, Understanding Interracial Unity. In 1995, he received the Wesley Logan Prize for the American Historical Association and the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and American Life and History for his book, Life for Us is What We Make It. There are so many ways Dr. Thomas has contributed to the discourse and understanding of race unity. The other book by him and Jordan, Detroit, Race Riots, Racial Conflict, and Efforts to Bridge the Racial Divide in 2013 was named a Michigan Notable Book and a winner of the 2014 State History Award by the Historical Society of Michigan. Recently, he co-authored with William Smith the book Race, Amity, America's Other Tradition, a primer. So we are so delighted to have the Thomases and Dave Grammer and our amazing host, Rainn Wilson, to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitra. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We have almost an audience of almost 300. That's pretty great. Welcome, everyone. Nice to see you all. Well, I can't see you all, but I'm so thrilled to be a part of this panel. You know, we were discussing, hold on one second. Are you guys seeing Chitra's frozen face on the screen the same way I am? Yeah. Maybe, I don't know if there's a way to fix that. We're seeing Chitra going, we're seeing you frozen on the screen. Oh. Okay. Great. So we were discussing what to talk about at this point with the social unrest and uprisings, the demonstrations following the brutal murder of George Floyd and the pain and anguish that so many people are feeling, the demonstrations that they're making. And the topic we came up with, I was really excited about this idea: how do we not go back to normal? How do we make sure that this is not just another protest in a long line of protests, that there's some grave injustice and people march and then things kind of go back to normal? How do we not go back to normal? So let me back up a little bit and just tell you a little bit about the Baha'i faith and the Baha'i perspective on this question. There may be, I'm guessing of the 295 people, there's about 173 that don't know very much about the Baha'i faith. So I'm going to give a little bit of a primer. The Baha'i faith is the newest of the world's religions. It started in the mid-1800s in Persia, which is now Iran, when the prophet founder Baha'u'llah, that was a title that was given to him that means the glory of God. Baha'u'llah proclaimed himself to be a divine teacher sent by God for humanity in this modern age. He proclaimed himself to be the latest in a long line of these divine teachers, spiritual teachers. Some call them prophets, some call them messengers. Baha'is often refer to these special figures as manifestations of God. This long line includes names you've heard of from the distant past, from Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Abraham. I probably left a few names out. And now most recently, Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah's message is for humanity in this modern day, like I said. So the social teachings of the Baha'i faith are incredibly progressive and prognosticated the current situation that we're in. Front and center in the teachings of the Baha'i faith is the unity of humanity. The fact that there is only one God, there's only one religion that is being constantly refreshed by these divine teachers that come every 500 or 1,000 years or so, and that there's one humanity on planet Earth. And we're one human family, and in all things we need to seek and strive for unity. So the elimination of racial prejudice is one of the central pillars of the Baha'i faith. You cannot talk about the Baha'i faith without talking about the elimination of racial prejudice and achieving racial harmony. There's many other teachings that are appropriate to this day and age: the equality of women and men, the harmony of science and religion, the importance of the individual investigation of truth. Another topic that is very similar, is very connected to the elimination of racial prejudice, which is the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty. And there's many, many more social teachings. I won't go into the history. There's a lot more to the Baha'i faith than that. That's just the tiniest bit of a sliver of a thumbnail. But there's much more to it. I don't have time to go into right now, but I did want to talk about the Baha'i take on racial prejudice. I want to say personally, for me, what's happened in the last month or so has been very disturbing and very eye-opening. I like to think of myself as a student of the race issues in the United States. I try and stay in a humble posture of learning, but I continually learn more and more about my own privilege, the layers and textures and facets of my privilege that I really may not be thinking about, that I'm blind to because of my privilege. I've been learning a tremendous amount, reading a tremendous amount. A lot of you have probably heard about this book called White Fragility. I'm reading it right now. It's super interesting and sums up so much of what I've wondered about. Why is it so difficult for white people to talk about race? But most importantly, I'm here to learn. I'm not here to lecture about racism. I'm really here to learn. So I want to share with you a couple of quotes about the importance of healing racism from a Baha'i perspective, and then pass it off to our incredible panel. I'll be here more as an MC tonight. This is a quote by Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi was the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, and he was the leader and center of the Baha'i faith for many decades in the earlier part of the 20th century. He wrote many letters to Baha'is around the globe, especially the American Baha'is. One of these very long letters was turned into a book called The Advent of Divine Justice, in which race is dealt with incredible specificity and compassion and insight. This is a couple of sections from that letter to the Baha'is and really the people of the United States, specifically about race issues, racial justice, race unity, elimination of prejudice. I'm going to share this with you now. As to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. The most vital and challenging issue, I want to highlight that. The ceaseless exertions which this issue of paramount importance calls for, the sacrifices it must impose, the care and vigilance it demands, the moral courage and fortitude it requires, the tact and sympathy it necessitates, invest this problem, which the American believers, the American Baha'is, are still far from having satisfactorily resolved, with an urgency and importance that cannot be overestimated. So before we go to the next slide, Nikki, just want to highlight some of these words. Ceaseless exertions, issue of paramount importance, sacrifices, care and vigilance, moral courage and fortitude, tact and sympathy it necessitates. There's so many nuances, so many facets to this issue. Let's go on to the next part of the quote, please. This is skipping a little bit into this letter. Let neither white nor black think that they can wait confidently for the solution of this problem until the initiative has been taken and all the favorable circumstances created by agencies that stand outside the orbit of their faith. Let neither think that anything short of genuine love, extreme patience, true humility, consummate tact, sound initiative, mature wisdom, and deliberate, persistent, and prayerful effort can succeed in blotting out the stain which this patent evil has left on the fair name of their common country. So we can have the quote go away now, Nikki. So I wanted to bring these up. This letter was written in the 30s, and it is so relevant today. And I wanted to show how precisely and importantly the issues of race have been central to the Baha'i work, the Baha'i belief, and the areas of Baha'i service. So we're so thrilled to have Doctors Thomas, the two doctors. It's a lot of doctors here. Dr. June Thomas, you began, or your main field of study is in urban planning. You've won many awards, written many books on race relations and urban planning in cities. But let's just go to the central topic. How do we not go back to normal? We're in a time of protest. What's the Baha'i oriented plan that follows this time of unrest? How do we not go back to normal?
Well, Rainn, first of all, I'd like to thank you for hosting this panel. I think this is a very timely topic, and the fact that you set up a special session to address this, I think, is very commendable. So thank you for doing this and allowing a forum. And I also want to start by just acknowledging the pain and suffering that a lot of people are going through, not just George Floyd and his family, but also the memories that this incident has brought up for many of us who have had experiences in our communities like this for many years. So it's just really a time of protest, but it's also a time of great pain. And it's a time of remembering things that happened to our community or our neighborhoods, our own family, things that happened in our own families. The kind of the specific issue, of course, is the apparent oppression of certain bad cops or the police. But I think any Black family can testify, and many others of color can testify to the just incidents in our lives that harken back to this feeling of terror that's been brought about by flawed policing. So I just want to acknowledge that, and also to acknowledge that in many ways it's quite heartening to see the rise of a movement that's trying to address that. To turn on the television and see the hundreds and thousands of people marching, and to feel that some people are protecting the marchers. So when the Black Lives Matters movement started in 2013 or thereabout, quite often the marches were all Black, and these were Black communities. But I get the feeling when I see the scenes from different countries, as well as here, that white brothers and sisters are coming out and protecting the Blacks who are marching. And so it's not quite so lonely anymore, because there are allies who are arising to try to help protect. So I think that's quite laudable. But I think it's important to note that marches and protests are not a flaw, but they're a limited means for bringing about social reform. For one thing, they tend to die down after a while. So you have a period of time when people get agitated and they arise and they have picket signs and they protest or march, and then eventually people have to go back to work or school or go on with their lives. And so that period passes. But we're dealing with entrenched problems here. So while we might see a few reforms, we may see some improved police practices, for example, or we may see some police departments defunded. The problems that face particularly African-American urban communities, and it isn't just there that the problem exists, but particularly those communities, those problems will not be solved by those piecemeal reforms. Those communities are suffering from extensive systemic racism that's entrenched in criminal justice, but also in schools, in healthcare, and beyond. So it's a deep-seated problem. So this particular panel, we're talking about what are some more lasting means of bringing about the social change that we need. And we believe, those of us on the panel are all members of the Baha'i faith, and we believe that there is really a need to create a deeper, lasting reform, and that this necessitates several changes, several kinds of endeavors. And I'd like to talk just very briefly about those. The first one is individual transformation. So this relates both to the victims and to the perpetrators. The quote that you presented from Shoghi Effendi began to lay out for the Baha'is a series of concepts that relate to the individual responsibilities in regard to racial prejudice. There are responsibilities for whites, for example, to overlook, to overcome their unconscious sense of superiority. There are responsibilities for Blacks when we see people making a genuine effort for us to accept those. But essentially, we have been receiving guidance in the Baha'i faith ever since the origins of the religion in 1844. We have had teachings and sacred verses that for that length of time have helped us understand how to overcome prejudice and how to see all people as equals. So I think we have to understand that this is a spiritual process that must be engaged in to create some sort of population that is able to overcome racial prejudice. The fact that you have some police officers who are acting out on their racial prejudice is due to a number of factors. It isn't just that individual's flaws. Somehow there was incomplete education. That person was schooled in racism. So there has to be individual action to help people to understand what needs to take place, to overcome their prejudices, and to live in harmony with different people of different colors, different races, different ethnicities. But then I think the next thing, so that's one level, there has to be individual change, and the Baha'i faith has many teachings about how that must take place. But then there's another set of activities, and these are the structures of a new society. And I'm using that particular phrase, the structure of a new society, was actually put out in a recent statement by the Ruhi Institute, which is an organization based in Colombia in South America, which has provided many of the materials that the Baha'is are using in our process of social transformation. And what we are seeing with these kinds of materials is that social transformation has to take place from the ground up. So there's only so much that Congress can do. Well, of course, we know that. We've seen there's only so much that Congress can and will do. But social transformation really has to start at the grassroots, at the family level, the neighborhood level, the village level, the city level. And so we've been trying to figure out how can we help families and neighborhoods to transform? What are the means of transforming these villages and cities? so that we can create communities of solidarity that cross the barriers of ethnicity and race and class. We believe that this requires an educational process, that we have to create a series of efforts to help people to live up to their human potential. For example, with children, we need to start with children to help them understand how to grow up in a way that they are not riddled by prejudice. We have to help them understand virtues. We have to help them associate with people with different races, children of other races. Another population that's very important is something called the junior youth. Those are the young teenagers, the age from 12 to 14. They're particularly important because that's such a transformational age. And if you can catch them before they're fully into their youth, which would be 15, 16, there's an opportunity to really help them to understand how they can be of service to humanity and how they can overcome some of the temptations that that age group expects. So we have a program for the junior youth. And then for the older youth and adults, we need to create forums so that people can operate in a way that they can free themselves from prejudice, understand their purpose in life, why were we created as human beings, and then be prepared to walk a path of service. So we have many opportunities for people to learn how to do this. All of these efforts combined can lead to a process of social and economic development based on grassroots action by people themselves on behalf of their communities. So I see this in cities where neighborhoods and communities get together and they start to create vehicles for self-education and for helping to resolve some of their own dilemmas, some of their own problems. Not to say they are responsible for those problems, because those are social-wide, society-wide reasons that those things were created. But from the grassroots, we have a tradition, certainly in the Baha'i community and the African American community, of undertaking social transformation from the ground up. So humanity is in its adolescence. This is a concept from the Universal House of Justice, which is the worldwide governing body of the Baha'i faith. And I think some of the manifestations of that adolescence include cops going crazy and beating people up and killing them. It includes chronic unemployment, and includes poor school systems. These are systemic problems. These will not be totally solved by marches and protests, although we're all very grateful that there are reforms that are coming and that people are willing to undertake those protests. But I think now we have to really dig in and figure out what are the means for creating more profound and lasting social transformation, and what are the tools for doing so. And I would say that the Baha'is have very viable tools that are field tested that we can offer to the world.
Wow, wonderful. Very well said, and perfectly articulated. Thank you so much. And we'll be coming back to some of the themes and concepts that June was talking about. So in this time of great uprising and chaos and difficulty, there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of anger. And we have with us today, as Chitra introduced, Dave Grammer, who's a marriage and family therapist, and among many other things, including capoeira, am I saying it right?
Capoeira
master. I'll have you know that I am a yellow belt in Shorin-ryu karate from when I was 18 years old. So you may have met your match.
We'll have to see.
Okay. But as a therapist, I was wondering if you could offer your insights on how we, in a healthy manner, transform our anger, our rage, the feelings that we're having in such a way that we can then move on to the next steps. How do we not go back to normal? One of the things But one of the things we need to do is process all of this feeling that's going around. Not to mention we're in the middle of a global pandemic, which also throws a little kerosene on the fire. So what feedback or advice or words of wisdom do you have around that?
So I think it's helpful to start with a basic understanding of how emotions work, because these problems and these issues have been around for a long, long time, and the emotions don't just dissipate because it's like, oh, I was angry and it's done now. We have this anger, it comes up in the moment, we go, ugh, we push it away, or it just keeps going and going, and it's like a balloon. You keep blowing air in, eventually it's going to break and it's going to have this big explosion, and it may come out sideways at someone you love, at work, kicking the dog. There's a lot of different ways this can come out. And so the real trick here is to utilize tools and techniques to keep ourselves constantly letting the air out of that tank, out of that balloon, so that even though you keep adding more in, we're letting it out so that it doesn't ever explode. I like to think of any emotion that a person is dealing with on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being total non-logical thinking, blackout rage kind of thing, horribly depressed, maybe suicidal kind of thoughts, and 1 being like, I'm okay, no big deal, nothing really bothering me. On that scale, if it's important not to get above like a 7 or an 8. Once we get to that level, you're kind of in the red zone of any emotion, and you're no longer thinking clearly. So that is a really important gauge to kind of figure out where am I at now? Am I at 5? Am I at a 6? Am I at a 9? Oh yeah, 7, whatever. And understanding then, now that I'm at the point where I'm no longer going to be able to have a logical conversation. Do I need to take a break? Do I need to take a time out? Because these conversations about race and about unity, by their very definition, must be painful right now, given the world today. They have to be hard. And so it's that finding that edge of out of control, in control, but being able to stay on the safe side of that, so that we're not just saying a lot of things and not meaning them. And there's so many different ways to do this is the great thing, that it's really helpful to just explore and try all the different things you can think of. For me, it's exercise and martial arts. For other people, it's music or drawing. There's a lot of different ways. It could be running, countless ways to let the air out of the balloon enough that the emotion is still there and still raw, but it doesn't take over. Because this race unity issue is not going to go away until people are able to stay in their feelings, talk about anger, frustration, fear, sadness, and share the enormity of the pain that they're feeling, while still being able to think clearly and logically. If you don't have those two pieces, you either have somebody raging and people being total logical automatons and not recognizing the pain and anguish and difficulty that's come up with this. And so it's a really necessary to have both of these and be able to stay in that zone of I like to think of like a 4 to 7 range of emotion, and recognizing when we're about to lose it, and maybe trying to take that break.
Great, thanks so much. Yes, and I've heard a lot of discussion about, again, the discomfort that so many of my white brothers and sisters, myself included, much of the time, have the discomfort in discussing race and white privilege and the work that needs to be done, and wanting it to just kind of go away and not have to look at it, or not have to look at oneself. But like you say, great transformation comes out of some discomfort and some pain. You have to go through some emotional, juicy stuff in order to come out the other side.
I actually would say that there can't be any growth without pain. It's just how it is.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. And we're in it. By the way, folks, participants of 324 of you, welcome. Thanks for joining us. There's a Q&A. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will be having questions later. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. And some people had previously sent questions in the days leading up to the panel that we'll be attempting to address as well. But moving on, Dr. Richard Thomas is here with us, and as Chitra explained earlier in the podcast streaming thing, lecture, whatever this is, he is a multi-award winning historian, especially around the African-American experience and the state of Michigan. So here's the topic. How do we not go back to normal? What's your take on that from a historical context, from your experience as a historian?
Well, I have several perspectives on this, and these perspectives are animated by the fact that I was born and raised in Detroit and went through the 1967 called it rebellion or riot, and there was all kinds of discussions about how not to go back to normal. And during that period of time, during the 1960s, many of us as African Americans experienced the riots and rebellions of Watts in 65 and Detroit and Newark in 67. I know where I was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was in college at a Black student meeting, and someone walked into the meeting and said Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. And then, of course, there were rebellions and riots and, throughout the country. And so, not as a historian, but also as a Black male, I have gone through these traumas of how not to go back to normal. As a historian, I have studied the urban disorder or riots. In 1919, there was riots throughout the country where literally white mobs engaged in terrorist activities against Black communities. And that was significant from a number of perspectives. 7 years earlier, Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah and the leader of the Baha'i faith at that time, had visited the American community in 1912, and he spoke at Howard University. And he pointed out to the people there that if they didn't resolve this racial crisis, that the streets would run with blood. Years later, he encouraged the Baha'is to establish race amity conferences, and they lasted throughout the 30s and the 40s. So as a historian, as I studied that, I looked at it not only as a Black male, looking at those atrocities that occurred against Black communities, but also trying to understand what role did the Baha'i play throughout that period to make sure that things didn't go back to normal. Now, of course, the Baha'is as a small community couldn't do much, but they could at least establish decades of guidance, helping the Baha'i community to share this message of racial unity, inviting people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Hansberry, the great Howard University historian, and a number of white and Black leaders to come together and discuss these issues and come up with some type of a plan. And this occurred throughout the 1920s and throughout the 1930s. So as a historian studying these things, I was inspired, number one, as a Baha'i, because I could look at these Baha'i communities and what they were doing and say, okay, how can I use this information to teach my students that no matter how bad things get during these periods of riots and conflict and what have you, but also how can they keep hope alive during, as Martin Luther King and others used to say, how can they keep hope alive? And so as I studied these developments, I was particularly concerned about how to inspire students to become change agents, how they could participate in these types of things. And so for close to 38 years, whenever I was teaching courses on race relations, I made sure that I would include in those courses the interracial struggle for racial justice, so that my Black students could see the importance of that interracial struggle. And we see this interracial struggle in the rallies. As a historian, I was particularly, pleased to see this multiracial gathering, because this multiracial gathering, if it can expand and sustain itself, it could then begin to build or rebuild that beloved community that we talked about so much, in the 1960s. And so my concern when we talk about how not to go back to normal is how do we expand and sustain the multiracial movement for racial justice. And for over 30-something years, I taught my students not only about race, but what role they would play as white students and Black students in the struggle. I helped my white students to understand the history of white Americans in the struggle for racial justice during the abolitionist period and the civil rights movement and what have you, so that they could have heroes and heroines to participate in this. And I've taught the Black students to understand that they always had white allies throughout this struggle. There were always white allies. And so when we talk about how not to go back to normal, as June has pointed out, where these rallies and what have you are very important, protests are very important. But friends, what we have to realize is that we've seen this throughout the history of racial conflict, okay? What we need now is to make sure that those things can be expanded into sustainable multiracial movements for racial justice. That then will provide the foundation for the systemic changes that we are concerned about. And so this topic is very dear to me. And one last thing is dear to me also, that because when I think of Floyd George, I go back to the many cases of when Black males were killed by white police officers. I've written about that, and I've seen it. I've been in situations where white police officers have grabbed me and handcuffed me and thrown me in jail. And now, as the father of a Black male and a grandfather of two Black males, I'm very, very concerned. I got a lot of skin in the game. Any Black parent has a great deal of skin in the game. And so we have a heavy investment that this not go back to normal.
Thank you very much. Really, really beautiful, moving. Thank you so much. You were talking about speaking with your students and inspiring your students in a movement towards racial justice from a historical context and moving forward, giving them kind of hope and vision. And that's one of the topics we did want to address with the panelists today, is speaking to young people, working with young people, Dr. June Thomas spoke about the Baha'i work with junior youth and with youth, and the grassroots bill and virtues with children. Earlier, maybe we can come back to some of that. But speaking to kids, to youth about racism, about white privilege, about the history of racism, and what we can do moving forward is so key across the board. And I'll start with you, Dave Grammer, as a therapist, and you've worked a lot, I know, with teens, troubled teens, done group therapy and rehabilitation with teens. Do you have any points of view about how we speak to young people about these really difficult and charged issues?
I think the key anytime, especially with adolescents, but even with the junior youth, kind of the 10 to 13 area as well, being really direct is super important. And not beating around the bush, not using euphemisms, but calling things what they are, using terms like we have white privilege, like I have white privilege, or whatever the experience is being, just super direct and honest and open about what is going on, and owning our own missteps when we've made them, and recognizing, oh yeah, I've said and done these things, and that is really not an acceptable way to do it. And being honest with our kids or with youth or whoever it is really valuable. We also need to recognize that compassion is really important for these kids as well. That they have a lot of big emotions and they don't always know how to handle them. And so fear and anger, especially for, a lot of or confusion, especially for a lot of white kids, not understanding why this is such a big deal, not understanding the other side at all. But being able to be compassionate towards that on some level and saying to them, yes, I understand that. Now let's give you perspective, and going into the whole history of it, going all the way back and really laying it out so that they have a sense of understanding that the frustration and the pain that maybe a white person is feeling now in confusion is really just a drop in the bucket to what the African American community has been dealing with for the last 400 years, right? And like I said, don't hold back on that. Maybe you don't go into specific details about brutalities and things, but it depends on the kid. If the kid's open and available and mature enough for it, maybe they need that. So just being allowing for those conversations to happen.
Thank you. One of the things that I've really been thinking a lot about during this latest time of turmoil, uprising, civil unrest, is this idea, and it's been online a lot and people have been writing about it a lot. And the author Ibram Kendi talks about in his book on how to be an anti-racist, was kind of, and Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility talks about how we have to redefine what being a racist is. And in the old days, being a racist is like calling people names, spitting, and actively hating on someone. But having racist tendencies can be much more nuanced and complicated than that. Obviously, that's racist, but there's other ways to be racist. But so many, especially white Americans, say, "Well, I'm not racist." I have relatives that, if you talk about race, they're like, "I'm not racist. I didn't own slaves. Why are you talking to me about this?" And the idea of this book, of Kendi's book, is how to be an anti-racist. Like, it's no longer enough to just be like, well, I'm passively saying I'm not racist, but how do we be an active anti-racist, to fight racism, to see it, to call it out, to witness it, to study it, to learn. And I imagine, I'm just kind of going off the top of my head, I imagine that that's really important in working with kids too, is to work with kids and junior youth and youth about how to be anti-racist. And Dr. June Thomas, do you have any thoughts on that, or any other thoughts on speaking to kids, working with kids to affect this grassroots change that you were addressing earlier?
Yeah, well, first of all, the guidance we've received that seems to work from the Universal House of Justice suggests that just focusing on race relations as the focus of programming or conversations is insufficient, because it kind of starts and stops at the level of words. And so what they've suggested, particularly in some of the letters we've received recently, a compilation of wonderful letters they wrote from, I think, about 1996 until the present, about how Baha'i should look at this issue of racial unity. And one of the things they said is that we should best address racial unity within the context of community building. And so they suggested, for example, that we should hold these children's classes or these meetings in our homes in a way that bridges racial divides. And there we talk about race, but it's in the context of some other positive activities that are taking place, rather than gazing at our navels about what is wrong with us or wrong with somebody else. And I will point out that with children and youth, especially, if they're being raised in an environment where they never see anyone different, it's going to be very, very difficult to raise them to be prejudice-free. So part of this idea is there some way we can create interracial, multiracial communities from the ground up, so that the children see other races when they play with them, they're in their children's classes, they're in their other youth activities. And can that be guided by some materials that talk about the fact that ye are all the leaves of one tree, that you are all the same? Can those kinds of readings and writings permeate those activities so that these children and these youth grow up believing that that is the truth, because it is. We're all essentially the same. So I think there are lots of opportunities. There are lots of ways that we could do this, but it should be in the context of both individual change, not just changing ourselves to make ourselves anti-racist, but also developing communities that are characterized by bonding across all characteristics, as well as by community building.
And I think to go along with that, that sparked in my mind too is the importance of devotional gatherings and praying together. And Baha'is believe in the power of prayer to build community, to build bridges between hearts, to connect diverse groups of people who are all worshiping the same divine creative source. And I think that's also an important component. We have some questions in the Q&A, but before I go there, Dr. Richard Thomas, I just wanted to bring up that you had, I have some notes here. What was it called? You created at Michigan State University multiracial unity living experience and spent decades working with youth, college students, both Black and white, bringing them together. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or what you learned, what your takeaway was? Is it a model that can be easily emulated or replicated?
Well, first, just a little background. I think you all recall some of the racial tension that occurred after the O.J. Simpson verdict. And on our campus, and probably campuses around the country and in other social spaces, there was a great deal of racial polarization. People, Blacks and whites, were very upset for different reasons over that verdict. And our campus was really polarized. And so I got together with a colleague, Dr. Jean Gazelle, and we decided that we would work with Black and white students. The first thing that we decided that we would do was to go into the residence halls and have dinner with these students, because, as the research pointed out, Black and white students and other students of other ethnic background tended to sit at tables by themselves. And so we started working with those kids, breaking bread with those kids, and then having sessions with them about race relations or what have you, and then designing classes dealing with the history of race relations. We took them on field trips. We helped them to deal with all kinds of racial conflicts. We helped them to build bonds. One of the last things that we did, among others, was we took them to South Africa, where we taught courses in comparative race relations, so that they could see that as a laboratory. Dr. Jean Gazelle took over years ago, and so she's still working with parts of that program that has extended to include a lot more individuals. But at least that was an opportunity to get kids from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to come together and to become change agents and to build relationships.
Let's go to a few questions. Thank you. Another question for Dr. Richard Thomas. Lex Musta asks, which examples of the other tradition, and this being race amity, have you witnessed in real time?
Oh. Was that Smitty asking that question?
Yeah.
I bet you that was Smitty.
Is that a secret stealth question?
Have you witnessed in real time? Yeah. Well, there's I'm working with Dr. William Smith and a group of other people who are trying to establish an institute of race amity in Atlanta. Dr. Smith and I have been working together for many decades. He's also a Baha'i, and we co-authored a book dealing with the other tradition, dealing with the tradition of Blacks and whites and other groups working together. And so that has been that has been one of the major forms of, if you talk about how not to go back to normal, that has been one of the one of the best models.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dr. June, someone asks here, Michelle Carroll asks about the letters that you referenced from the Universal House of Justice, say that we're suffering from a spiritual illness, and the idea of prejudice being a spiritual disease, a disease of the heart, a disease of the soul. Can you address this and what Baha'i, we've talked about what Baha'is are doing at the grassroots to address it, but maybe can you talk a little bit about the disease of racism, the spiritual disease of racism?
Yeah, so I'm sure there are many definitions of racism, but if we accept the teachings of the major religious leaders, the major manifestations of God, all of them in some way say that that we are all the same under the skin. We are human beings before God. So when we exhibit prejudice toward another person, when we prejudge them or turn away from them because of their external qualities, that means that we don't really understand that they are a reflection of the divine. That really what's important about them is what's in their hearts and what's in their souls, not how much melanin they have in their skin. So Abdu'l-Baha, who's the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, says that really one of the ways to overcome this prejudice is to begin to look at people as if they were a manifestation of this divine. And you can't do that and remain prejudiced. So to just tell people you should not be prejudiced or to make people understand, well, you know, Black people are just as good as white people, is not going to take if they don't accept this essential oneness of humanity and the fact that all human beings are divinely created by God. And so there is this fundamental equality that's not accepted if you don't accept that there is a spiritual nature to this need for equality. I think that's a long way to say we're all equal. We're all equal.
No, that was great. That was great. Hey, Dave Grammer, Noreen Bost writes, I've long thought that racism is due to the basic human desire to feel special and important. And an easy way to do that is to find an obvious difference in others, such as skin color. And there was that blue-eyed experiment in the 70s, which I vaguely remember from Intro to Psychology. Do you, as a psychologist, do you have any thoughts on the psychological underpinnings of this, of prejudice and this idea of otherness and scapegoating the other?
First, I'm a therapist, not a psychologist. I'm not. That's a doctorate. But
okay.
But yes,
I'm going to give you a doctor. I'm going to give you an honorary doctor.
I'm required to say I'm not a doctor. But anyway, this idea comes from, I mean, it's evolutionary if you think about it. Way back in back in history, when it was small tribes, there was a lot of fear. You didn't know how the other people that you run across were going to treat you. Were they going to be friendly? Were they not going to be friendly? And so it was much safer to just not interact or to keep everyone separate and to just stay away from them. And this feeds into a more interesting idea of inclusiveness, right? The fastest way to be included in a group is to exclude someone else. It's not the most effective and it's not the best way to do it, but it's the quickest way is to then go, oh, we're not like that person. And we can all be together because we're not like that person. And this concept then feeds into these racist ideas and views of just like, oh, well, we're a unit over here. We're going to protect ourselves and we're going to stay safe and keep ourselves here. And so we're kind of overcoming this idea of this thought process that is like, well, I can get in. I mean, you see this really obviously in like middle school and high school lunchrooms where one kid gets scapegoated and everybody makes fun of them and they're like, what did I do? Right. And it's just because the rest of the people in the group are so terrified of not being included that they pinpoint this one person. So it's kind of a combination of what the question was asking, but I think it is more about inclusivity, and then it just gets ingrained over generation and generation and generation. And there's actually been some research recently about how do we overcome these belief systems. And what the research is showing is that this much fear counteracts this much logic and knowledge. And so, you know, when we were looking at the quote from Shoghi Effendi and talking about like the amount of work that is required and heroism and moral fortitude and things, it's because of this offset that we have to be this logical and reasonable and saying, no, this is where these ideas are wrong, to come against just a little bit here. And so we got, you know, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that evolutionary survival mechanism of my tribe or my cave or my valley or my mountain or whatever it is better than that other one, filled with mistrust and a warlike attitude, was easier to survive. So it may have, who knows when, a few thousand years ago, 10,000 years ago, been beneficial to be racist in some way. Probably not really, but you know what I mean.
Well, yeah.
And now it was brought up before about the, you know, humanity emerging from its adolescence to its maturity, and letting go of that school lunchroom mentality and that otherness mentality, and that my tribe or my cave is better than your tribe or your cave, is part of the inevitable kind of spiritual spiritualization of the planet into maturity. And I'd love to hear, please.
No, but there is institutional racism.
Oh, for sure.
And there is structural racism. So while that may have been the beginning of it all, I mean, since then, I mean, just look in this country, the institution of slavery. And right now we're looking at institutionalized segregation that was aided and abetted by federal policies that made sure that Blacks could not move out into the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's gone beyond individual racism now, because people can be free of prejudice individually and still benefit from a society that has been structured around racism. So some people are now referring to spatial justice, that essentially we need not just individual justice, not just criminal justice, but spatial justice. Because just for one example, Black families have lost untold amounts of wealth because they were held back and kept in certain central city neighborhoods during generations when they couldn't move out to the suburbs, because the FHA would not give loans to Black families or to multiracial neighborhoods. So all of the individual manifestations of racism or prejudice are then reinforced by these other things, such as spatial prejudice and such as federal policy. So it's a deeply entrenched problem, which is why we have to talk about creating social structures, new social structures, not just overcoming individual prejudice, but also creating new social structures that are not based on these specific problems.
Thank you very much for that. Yes. And going off of that, the systematized racism, Dr. Richard, another key Baha'i teaching is the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty. And a lot of what I've been reading about around race in this recent time has been about economics. Do you have a context to talk about this intersection? Again, how do we not go back to the same old normal? We have to address some of the economics, both of racism and of the extremes of wealth and poverty.
Yeah, that's an extremely complex question. It's a good question. I'm not an economist. June's an urban planner, so she can address that to a certain extent. But when we talk about the extremes of wealth and poverty, we're talking about a historical, structural, systemic problem that has existed for years, and there's going to have to be a lot of systemic interventions in order to change that. Several economists have talked about how to go about doing that, but it's going to take political will, in quotes. All right, it's going to take the development of a nationwide consciousness that economic justice should be a priority. And so that's one of the big problems that Martin Luther King talked about when he talked about the limitations of integration. You see, he realized that integration was very, very important. He fought for it, but he also realized that integration without economic transformation, without an elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty, that there would be no way to sustain whatever things could come out of integration.
There's a question here thank you very much for that. There's a question, and I want to say too about that. It's something that it sparked in my head is, I went to high school in suburban Seattle. It was a pretty run-of-the-mill kind of blue-collar high school. And then I had the good fortune, in large part due to my white privilege, to go to a very wealthy high school in suburban Chicago. And of course, this is part of this systemic racism, and its linked with economics is the fact that property taxes feed the high school. So this high school I went to had a radio station on its roof. We had like 5 theaters because the area was very wealthy. And just, I'm not kidding you, 10 miles south in North Chicago, high schools had chain link fencing over the windows. And that's just an example that just popped into my head about how the link between systematized, pervasive racism and how it's connected into economics. People can certainly address that, but there's also a question that came in from Michelle Carroll as a middle school teacher, because we have 2 professors and a therapist who has worked with a lot of teens. She says, as a middle school teacher, I noticed that during lunch, the children grouped by color, race. How would you suggest I go about attempting to change this? Any thoughts, anyone?
Well, I think you have to be intentional. We were very intentional at Michigan State 20-something years ago. And so we were able to get students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to just sit and eat with us at the table. And people, students around, saw that. And we were able then to discuss with them the importance of bonding across race. I forget the name of the book. It says, "Why are all the Black kids sitting at the same table?" Okay, that came out years ago. The author will come to me in a minute. But it was a phenomenon that occurs when teachers do not, and even parents do not encourage students to break with that pattern. For many years, I worked with several people doing multicultural education in schools. And many teachers simply, well-meaning teachers didn't really see that as a priority. They weren't intentional. To them, it was natural. So this has to be an intentional intervention. You have to see it as wrong. And then you have to work to get kids to interact together.
Thank you very much. Nikki, I think we'll go to the next, the quote. Well, there's so many questions. There's 29 questions. The questions just came pouring in. They're so good. Except Mooney Harrison says, not a question. Hi, Uncle Richard and Auntie June. Love you. Couldn't pass on that one. Thanks, Mooney Harrison. A lot of Doctors Thomas fans here in the chats and on the questions. And I wanted to not necessarily end, because I would love to hear from the panelists again before we finish, but there's a couple of quotations I wanted to leave us with, or maybe spark additional conversation. The one on the right is from Buckminster Fuller. I don't know anything about Buckminster Fuller. I know that he had, sorry, my phone is ringing next door. Just ignore the phone that's ringing. But Buckminster Fuller invented the buckyball. That's all I know. But he says, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I love this quote. It's immediately shifts your perspective. Mm-hmm. And Baha'u'llah seems to echo this, although this was written 100 years before. Baha'u'llah says, the prevailing order appeareth to be lamentably defective. And can we go to the next slide? The Universal House of Justice is the administrative body that presides over the Baha'is of the world, and Baha'is believe that their guidance is extremely wise, and we study their letters and writings with great exactitude. And I just wanted to leave people with these quotes from the Universal House of Justice. And it's a little bit, again, going back to how do we not go back to normal? This is the Universal House of Justice's call to the Baha'is about some of the work that's in front of them from a recent letter. The establishment of peace is a duty to which the entire human race is called. The responsibility that Baha'is bear to aid that process will evolve over time, but they have never been mere spectators. They lend their share of assistance to the operation of those forces leading humanity towards unity. I love that. They lend their share of assistance to the operation of those forces leading humanity towards unity. They are summoned to be as leaven to the world. I love that. Leaven, of course, you know, is that little piece of yeast, you know, bacteria that you put in the bread. It's just a tiny bit, but it allows the bread to expand. And then it continues, and we'll go to the next one. Consider Baha'u'llah's words. This is a quote from Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith. So beautiful. Address yourselves to the promotion of the well-being and tranquility of the children of men. Bend your minds and wills to the education of the peoples and kindreds of the earth, that haply the dissensions that divide it may, through the power of the most great name, be blotted out from its face, and all mankind become the upholders of one order and the inhabitants of one city. So the importance of education is in here, and inhabitants of one city immediately made me think of Dr. June Thomas being an urban planner, the inhabitants of one spiritual city. But I would love to hear from the panelists about, when you hear these words from the Universal House of Justice and from Baha'u'llah specifically, about the task in front of us to change the world, to change perspective, to build from the grassroots. What comes to mind?
I like the term leaven for a number of reasons. You know, from the visit of Abdu'l-Baha in 1912 to the present, we have seen the Baha'i community engaged literally in thousands of efforts to bring people together. You know, throughout the 20s and 30s, they were the major group in this country supporting interracial conferences. And then they started Race Amity Day celebrations in hundreds of cities from 1957 even out to the present day. Talk in terms of the leavening. And so the Baha'is have been involved in these activities to try and give people a vision and a model of how to build a multi-racial community. And so I love the term leaven, because those activities, those conferences throughout the 20th century, those annual meetings, you know, throughout, you know, for the last 100 years, have helped to give people hope in terms of how do you go about building a multi-racial society. And so that's what we've been doing. And we've been doing it, you know, for 100 years, you see, or more than 100 years.
Yeah, so I'll just say that actually that's why I first noticed the Baha'i faith. I grew up in South Carolina under Jim Crow. And I know from personal experience that the only people who were interracial in their worship were the Baha'is. It was such an extraordinary sight to see. That was in the mid-60s, and those people had been working in interracial communities for 40, 50 years in South Carolina, whereas we still could not sit down at the lunch counter. So I think Baha'is have lived their faith in terms of race unity and racial justice, and I think that's what people are marching in the streets for. But I think the additional element that we talked about tonight is that Baha'is also have a program for community building. And we are essentially setting up devotional meetings, and we're sponsoring children's classes and youth programs and activities for adults. And so if a Baha'i asks you to participate in some of those, be aware that this is a community that has worked for social justice for many years, for racial unity for many years. and also has a fantastic community building structure.
Thank you. Dave, last thoughts on that?
Oh man, I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that. I think that I just, it really, as they were talking, as I was thinking about this kind of last quotation, it just reminded me of what Dr. June Thomas had said early on, this idea of like, we need to recognize the spirituality of every person. And as we do that, it, for me in my work, has allowed me to be, I don't want to say tolerant of bad behavior, but understanding to the, allowing me to have an understanding so that I don't just write someone off when they're espousing, racist beliefs or negative things or bothering me, or, saying something that really bothers me. I go back to that. I'm like, this is a person who has a soul and a spirit, and there is good there. I just got to find it, because right now I'm not seeing it and I'm not hearing it. But if I can find it, that will allows me, I find it as a technique to help me to stay in some of those difficult conversations and not just give up on people and walk away. And I think that this concept of not giving up on people and not walking away from these conversations in this process is going to be really, really necessary as we move forward.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Panelists, dear panelists, thank you so much. We have 33 more questions in the Q&A department. So we could certainly do part 2 of this. Love to hear more. I'm open to it. If the doctors Thomas are available.
Well, we aren't going anywhere for sure.
Okay. Great.
We're right here in our house.
Excellent. But this has been really a lot of fun. Thanks for letting me MC this. Thank you, Chitra and Nikki. Someone put in the chat here that there's a Race Amity Day on Sunday. I will be speaking. The theme is E Pluribus Unum. Again, this idea that America was founded on, out of many one, that we don't have much experience with or follow through with, but we should perhaps continue to strive for, out of many one. So that's on Sunday. And but any last thoughts here, panelists, before we go? And Chitra, I'll let you sign us all off. What's that, 4 p.m. Eastern on Sunday? Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists, our host. I really would love, if we have maybe a few more minutes, if any of you would like to have a closing thought.
Not for me.
No, right, yeah.
I think I said everything that I need to say for now. I mean, maybe when we get to those other questions, we'll have a lot of thoughts, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely, until we return. So want to sincerely thank each of you for being here, all the people who've tuned in to be with us. On behalf of the Wilmette Institute, I want to thank all of you and our commitment to having a space where we explore this most vital and challenging issue in all its different forms. Please visit wilmetteinstitute.org for upcoming webinars. And Nikki was kind enough to show us how. When you go on the homepage and scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the feature web talk, and then you'll see view all web talks, which will take you to the page for the next ones coming up. So many topics to explore. I think that list of ours is going to get longer and longer. From there is a question here which I hope we can answer next time about calling people out, and what are ways in which our dialogue can really bring the spirit of the faith. Maybe as we think about seeing the world in a certain way and seeing racism for what it is, we take that opportunity to be reminded of the nobility of all human beings, to call them in, call them into dialogue, call them into consultation, so that we all become protagonists of the oneness of humanity. And our panelists have given us so many tools, things to read and follow up on. I just want to share with one last thing. So my family and I have been consulting about what are some things we can do in our neighborhood. And we've gone around and met our neighbors and knocked on doors and talked about how we hope to have interracial, intercultural unity dialogue about that. And I think we maybe had 30 flyers, and our first Zoom meeting, over a dozen people came, and people are ready. They are ready to be agents of positive change, and we have to take the steps. And I think the most liberating thing for my anger towards injustice is action. So I know that our panelists gave us so much to think about, and I look forward to the next one. Hopefully they will be here with us again. And thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Yeah.